Thank you. I'm screen sharing and you're looking at a map. Okay. Hi, I don't know why you just are seeing my screen instead of my lovely face, so I'll go away from that. Welcome to the June meeting of the Cross Timbers chapter of Texas Master Naturalists. It's 7:01 p.m. so we'll get started, especially for those folks who saved our heinies by saying that they would speak at the last minute, and so we'll let that person get started and get finished. I'd like to make one announcement before I have Mary Beth introduce our speaker. Most of you are aware that the applications are open for our training class, and the applications will be open until June 30th or through June 30th. I just posted in the chat. If you know someone who is interested and may want to be joining us, the application link, you can go to our CTMN.org webpage. If you'll click on the button that says join us and scroll all the way down to the bottom, that's where the link is for the application. And we're very excited. We already have 34 applications for our training class 2021. I want to thank Melinda, Brent, Ryan Wiggins. Since we have a lot of visitors, I hope we can all use last names. Melinda Pajak is our education director. Brent Franklin is her wingman. Is that a good way to say it? Glenda Walker, Joan Carey, and Ryan Wiggins are on the education committee. We are hoping that between July the 1st and July the 20th, we'll be able to select the new members, and the new members will get their
Get out of there.
As far as, okay, thank you, Melinda, and I'm sorry your webcam is broken. As far as etiquette for Zoom meetings, as our state folks always talk about etiquette before these meetings, please remember, if you have questions, please type them into chat. Please use full words rather than acronyms, so that those of us who are trying to read the question will understand it. If you are not speaking, it would be great if you could mute, so that when someone in your family yells at you about something, we won't all hear it and laugh. So please put those in mute. Again, after Rachel speaks, I'll have a few other announcements, and I'll open up the floor to any other announcements. So Mary Beth, will you introduce our speaker?
Gladly. We originally had a speaker lined up to tell us about photography of nature, of wildlife, but he had some unfortunate things happen, inconvenient things happen, and had to cancel. So Rachel, thank you so much for always being there for us and supporting our chapter. She works for Texas Parks and Wildlife. She's been there since 2013, and she is our chapter advisor representing Texas Parks and Wildlife. She is the Texas Parks and Wildlife urban wildlife biologist for DFW. She is an Arlington native, has always been fascinated with nature. She has a master's degree in wildlife ecology from Texas State, where her thesis involved using radio telemetry to study range and habitat use of a reintroduced population of javelina in central Texas. She has worked in the deer breeder program before becoming a DFW urban wildlife biologist in 2016. She has proven to be dedicated to community education and outreach, and become an integral part of our chapter. So Rachel, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Took me a second to unmute myself. You think that that would be like instinctual at this point. Thank you everyone for tuning in this evening. So what we're going to talk about today is sort of urban ecology, but kind of get specifically into some of the nitty-gritty of how being in an urban ecosystem influences wildlife and how they manage to survive in the built world that we have created and how that all works out. So kind of start here by asking the question that, you know, a lot of people kind of think of when, you know, they hear that I'm like an urban biologist, or, you know, wondering why we're here to talk about urban ecology tonight. Like, why are we talking about cities if we're talking about wildlife? Because a lot of kind of people wonder, like, do cities matter for wildlife? And obviously the answer, I think, is yes. But to kind of put into perspective why it's so important. So this is a satellite image of Earth at night, and it has all of those yellow spots. Those are all of the cities. That's light pollution that you're seeing. That's all the light coming out from the cities. And the reason why I like to show this is because it shows how much of our country we occupy. But also, if you start to think about, especially if you're looking at like the eastern half, there's not really a whole lot of spaces that are not going to be heavily influenced by people in our country. Like, our cities take up a significant part of our landmass. And so that means wildlife is going to have to figure out how to navigate that in one way or another. So in Texas, we kind of have this mythology, this idea that we're this rural, wild state, but the reality is we have been a majority urban state since the 1950s or the 1960s. And today, over 85% of Texans actually live in urban areas, especially within this little triangle that just appeared on the screen. This is known as the Texas Triangle Mega Region, which goes from DFW to San Antonio to Houston. And this area of the state especially is expected to see large growth. Like, the population is supposed to double over the next several decades. And some people will say that eventually that little triangle is just going to fill all the way in. If you've ever spent time like driving down I-35 over the last several years, you've probably witnessed some of this, like, you know, some of that kind of melding together where all of the cities are just kind of starting to become one thing. Another way to look at this, these are the counties of Texas sized according to their population size instead of their geographic size. And you notice how quickly, like, West Texas, like, it's gone, right? But this also kind of gives you an idea of where, like, we're pretty heavily weighted towards the eastern half-ish of the state with our population. And you know, Texas is a big state, and our population takes up a lot of that area. And so this is important because while we certainly have like wild and you know, less influenced by people areas of Texas, and those areas are great and they're beautiful and they're super important, it's also important that we recognize that we cannot conserve wildlife unless we have people on board with that conservation of wildlife. And the cities are where our people are. And so most people are going to experience wildlife. Their first encounters with wildlife are going to be the wildlife that they see at their neighborhood park or in their backyard or walking around their neighborhood. And so we want to make sure that we have as many opportunities as possible for people to experience wildlife in their community, because that way they learn to love and appreciate wildlife that's not in their community, right? So that's one reason why this is so important. So this is a series of photos just from Google Earth of the DFW Metroplex, going from 1984 to 2001 to 2018. And DFW is getting bigger, y'all. If you have lived here long enough, You know, I grew up in Arlington. I don't remember really thinking of Dallas and Fort Worth as separate cities, but I've known people who have been here long enough who remember when they were distinct separate cities that didn't have all of this stuff in between them. But if you look, so if you look at this shows you urban sprawl, which is basically the footprint of our metroplex getting larger. And the longer you look at this, the more things you'll start to notice. So you'll notice which areas seem to be growing more. Like look at the northeastern parts of the metroplex, like McKinney, Plano, like those used to be pretty tiny towns that are growing a lot. And then you also notice, so not only is the metroplex expanding outward, but if you look inside, we're getting a lot more gray area on the inside of the footprint too. And then just one thing that I find really interesting, Joe Lake didn't exist in 1984. We've gained a new reservoir in this amount of time. So a lot of things can, you know, happen over just a few decades, and the landscape can really change a lot. And I feel like it's easy to forget because we live here, that DFW is big. And so here I have this blue outline is the state of Connecticut. And I like to use this picture just because it really puts into perspective that, like, you know, we're not being super ridiculous, not visiting our friends that live in Frisco all the time if we live in Mansfield, right? Because that's a long drive. That's a state worth of driving. And there's several other states that we are close to in size or bigger than. But it's important to keep in mind that when these changes are happening, it's not happening at a small scale. It's the scale of a state, not a Texas-sized state, but a state. That's a big scale. And this is another interesting thing that I came across not too long ago. So this is the city center of Siena, Italy, compared to a highway interchange in Houston. And y'all know that we have interchanges similar to this in DFW, but that city in Italy houses 30,000 people compared to that interchange in Houston, which doesn't. And again, Texas is big, okay? This is kind of the point, like giving y'all a sense of scale of the land area that we're talking about. And we tend to have a more sprawled out, we're not as close together, we're not as densely populated as some other areas are. Texas is pretty sprawled out. I've seen once before, and I'm sure there's some historians in here that probably know this better than me, but I've seen it referenced that part of the reason why Texas is so sprawled out has a little bit to do with the fear of nuclear war. Like around the time that Texas was really developing was that was a concern. And so there was a little bit of an intentional design that we're like less, like the United States is less vulnerable if we're more spread out. So I don't know, maybe that's true, maybe that's not. Like I said, I'm sure someone knows the answer to that better than me, but it's one interesting theory, I guess. So what is an urban ecosystem? An urban ecosystem is the natural areas that exist within our built environment. And there's a lot of them, and a lot of them are really cool. They're just like any other ecosystem, but they have a kind of a different set of constraints that they operate under because they have a different set of influence by being so heavily influenced by people. One of the biggest things that probably just jumps right in your mind when we talk about urban ecosystems is habitat fragmentation. And so this is basically where you have patches of natural habitat that get broken up for smaller pieces. So you have one tract of land being managed one way, it gets sold, and it gets broken up into smaller tracts of land that are used for different purposes. So some of it may be a parking lot, some of it may be Walmart, some of it may be a park, some of it may be a neighborhood. And so, but you end up with different conditions on the ground and different management strategies for each spot. So what do our urban green spaces look like? Well, there's lots of different types of urban green space and lots of different ways that they can look. So urban green spaces can be golf courses. Now I'm cheating a little bit with this photo because this is Tierra Verde in Arlington, which is specifically managed for wildlife, but I want y'all to know that even a golf course that is not designed with wildlife in mind can still have a benefit for wildlife because it's still a green space. It may not always be the most natural, but it is a green space, and our wildlife that exists in cities tend to be pretty good at finding ways to persist in those areas. What probably jumps to mind first when I mention urban green space is parks. So parks are absolutely an urban green space, and a lot of parks have a really great value for wildlife. Not all of our parks look this great, like with this restored Blackland Prairie that we got going on in this photo. Some of our parks are geared more towards human recreation, right? Like soccer fields and things like that. And those are important too. Not all of our parks have to be geared for wildlife, but some of them certainly are, and they're great habitat for wildlife. Our water bodies are also another important habitat for wildlife and another important urban green space. So these can, different types of water bodies, right? Like creeks, rivers, ponds, lakes, all that stuff. And a lot of times these are the places that are left behind after development. So if you think about your favorite park, does it have some sort of water body associated with it? A lot of times, yeah. And sometimes they're, man-made ponds that were created for the purpose of the park, but a lot of them will have little creeks or something going through it. And that's because it's pretty hard to develop in water. And sometimes it's not legal to develop in water. So a lot of times, these are places that get set aside, and they can also be really important as transportation corridors for wildlife, especially with our riparian areas. Vacant lots. These can sometimes be really great habitat for wildlife, and they vary a lot in quality. Sometimes it is mowed Bermuda grass. Sometimes it is something like this that's, a remnant of Eastern cross timbers habitat, and everything in between. And what's interesting is that sometimes, because these areas are less frequented by people, they actually have more abundant wildlife than a heavily visited natural area that, people are going up and down the trails all the time. And speaking of trails, linear trails, they're very in vogue right now. And they're not necessarily designed with wildlife in mind. They're more for human recreation, but that's kind of a green little strip that can be very beneficial for wildlife. And I know I'm preaching to the choir with this one, but depending on how you landscape your yard can also provide really great habitat for wildlife and be a wonderful green space. So how are these different from more rural green spaces? What's the difference? So they have altered habitat conditions, and these are just kind of a few of the big ones that can create issues for urban wildlife. So one is soil structure. When you think about that soil profile, if you think back to like high school science class, you know that the top two layers of soil have the most organic material and the most nutrients in them. And what typically happens when a developer comes in to develop a property is they're going to scrape all that off, and they will frequently replace that with topsoil that is from somewhere else, which may have all sorts of things, invasive species hitchhiking in there, and it's also just going to have a different chemistry. You also can run into soil compaction in areas that experience heavy traffic, which can basically, decreases the permeability for water, and it also will kill vegetation and things like that. Water quality, with all of our impervious cover, that water, instead of hitting the ground and soaking down, it tends to just run off. And as it runs off, it will collect things before it ends up in our nearest water body. And so that can influence our water quality. Also, lack of vegetation and highly modified or channelized water bodies can influence water quality as well. Invasive species. Invasive species can be anywhere, but because we have so many people moving things around in urban areas, we tend to have more invasive species in urban areas. We also have to deal with the urban heat island effect, which is, as soon as it decided to stop raining, we're starting to get pretty familiar with the urban heat island effect now that it's summer very rapidly here in DFW. Excuse me. And so this is basically all of our built environment, especially like our concrete and our asphalt, is very good at retaining heat, and it does not cool off as fast as dirt and plants would, essentially. And so because of that, our cities are hotter on average than the surrounding areas. And this effect is most pronounced at night because, again, the concrete's really good at retaining the heat. And so, in a more rural area, the sun goes down, it cools off pretty quick. Here in August, you wake up at 6 a.m. and it's 85 degrees. My husband is he's a pilot, and he was flying over Las Vegas recently, and it was 3 a.m. Vegas time, and it was 95 degrees in Vegas at 3 a.m. Think about that. Hurts my brain a little bit. We also have altered disturbance regimes. So we had historic natural disturbances throughout all of Texas that helped to shape our ecosystem. So things like naturally occurring wildfires, migrating herds of bison, floods, other things, droughts, things like that. And these shaped our ecosystems by doing things like suppressing woody species and creating our prairies and keeping the understory from getting too thick or depositing nutrients in new locations. And we've changed a lot of that, or a lot of that stuff doesn't really exist anymore. Like, we don't have roaming herds of bison anywhere in the US anymore, at least not truly free-ranging bison. We also have top predators that have been removed from urban areas. We don't really have large predators, which can become a problem when we have supplemental feeding, which is artificially inflating the prey species that would be taken out by those top predators. So in urban areas, we have 3 different types of plant communities, and plants are important to consider because they really lay the foundation for the ecosystem, right? Because whatever plants can grow on those particular soils is going to determine what sort of wildlife, what sorts of animals can come along and use those plants for food or shelter. So best case scenario, we have remnant vegetation. So this is something that is representative of what historically would have been found there. We can also have colonizing plant communities, and this is where there was some sort of disturbance, and now the disturbance is gone, but something else is growing back. And so that could mean that maybe succession got set back a few stages, and instead of, a really nice mature prairie with, good, strong prairie species that don't like disturbance, we might have, some other things coming in, like, mesquite, which is a native, but it gets aggressive, or something like poverty weed or something like that. So we could have, this could be natives that like disturbance, or anytime there's a disturbance, you open up a window for an invasive species to become established. So like our good friend privet that we have here in this photo. And then the other type of plant community is a planted community. So this is all of our landscaped areas, and sometimes these are really great native plant gardens. More often than not, though, it looks like this picture where it's predominantly exotic species, which provide little value for wildlife. So how do species respond to all of this? they basically have three options. So they can move and find a habitat that is suitable somewhere else. This sounds great, but it's not always that realistic, because if there is a great habitat nearby, there's probably some critters that already live there, and they're probably not going to be too keen on sharing their new place with someone else. So the second option is they can adapt. So they can learn how to cope with whatever the change on the ground is and be able to survive in spite of that change. And if they can't relocate and they can't adapt to the change, they're not going to survive. So we can very broadly lump wildlife into two different categories. So we have, on one hand, we have our generalists. These are things that can eat just about anything, live just about anywhere. They have a lot of options. These are things like our coyotes and our raccoons. On the other end of the spectrum, we have specialists, which have a very specific set of requirements that they need in order to survive. So that might mean that they might only make their nest in a very specific type of tree over a certain height and a certain number of years old. Or it could be something like the horn lizard, where over 95% of its diet comes from harvester ants. What happens to the horn lizard if there aren't harvester ants, if that makes up almost its entire diet, right? So it doesn't pay to be a specialist during time in an urban area where resources may be disappearing. So what we typically see in urban areas is we have an increase in the number of generalists and a decrease in the number of specialists. So if you start in downtown Fort Worth and you work your way outward to where you're not in a city anymore, you're going to be driving for a while, but as you go along that gradient of urban to rural, you're going to go from the least amount of biodiversity, the least number of species in the downtown area. And then as you get to the more rural area, you're going to have the most number of species, the greatest level of biodiversity. And this is a pretty intuitive concept. Like if I asked y'all this, you would probably be like, oh yeah, there's going to be more biodiversity in a rural area, right? So that's not really groundbreaking information, but it's interesting when we start to think about what types of things determine which species can persist in an urban area or in a suburban area. And one of the things is remnant vegetation patches. So what do those remaining green spaces, what do they look like? What sort of condition are they in? What shape are they? And I've got a couple of examples that we can talk about here. So this is a little 10 or 11 acre, I think, park. This is, oh my gosh, Blackland Prairie Park in Arlington. A lot of y'all are probably familiar with this, probably going like, I think I know that park. And so this is a park that has a lot of master naturalist involvement, and it's a great little native prairie remnant. But when you look at this park, think about what its size and shape and its location mean for what species you would expect to find there. And so right off the bat, you're probably thinking 10 acres, not that big, right? And it's not. If you are something like a white-tailed deer that needs a few hundred acres, you can't survive solely on this 10-acre patch, right? And so if you start looking at this area around it, this will also help determine what species can live here. And this little park is surrounded by roads and warehouses and houses and a school, it looks like. So this little 10 acres is really a habitat island. And I want to stress, these little habitat islands are super important. We need more of these. We need more little 10-acre patches of native prairie. That would be fantastic if we had these little prairies throughout the Metroplex, because they are really significant. But the types of species that are going to be able to use this habitat are determined by the shape and size and the location of this little habitat patch. So we're not, so this is great for animals that have a small home range, or animals that are really good at dispersing easily, and they're not going to be as bothered by that road or these warehouses and things like that. So on a similar scale, we have Oliver Nature Park, which is about 40 acres, I believe. And so that's a little bit bigger, but it's not like super significantly bigger in the grand scheme of things. But what is significantly different about Oliver is when you zoom out, Walnut Creek is connected to a much bigger green space that is several hundred acres in size. And so that little, this kind of like little narrow green patch of vegetation that occurs along this creek, because you can't really develop in the creek, right, is a really important travel corridor. And this connectivity, so when people talk about habitat connectivity, this is what they're talking about, maintaining strips of vegetation so that wildlife can move comfortably from one kind of patch of habitat to another. And then you can also have things where, like the Great Trinity Forest, which is one of the largest urban forests in the country, where it's big enough in size that you can actually have some kind of interior habitat that's not as influenced by all of the city surrounding it. And if you think about it, this is where we get some of our, rarer species that show up in DFW. So what are some other things that can determine which species persist? Well, one is competition with exotics, right? It's going to be hard for bluebirds to get all of their nest cavities if they have to compete with house sparrows and starlings. So what exotics are present and how they compete for the same niche as the native species that are present is something that's important. Also, non-native predators, things like house cats. So domestic cats, whether they're feral or whether they are like an owned cat, if you let them outside, they wreak havoc on our native wildlife. And so they kill an estimated 2.4 billion with a B, birds every single year. And that's whether it's a truly feral cat or if it's a cat that, comes in at night and gets fed and all that stuff, but their owner lets it run around during the day. Their cats are adorable, but they are furry little murder machines. Something else that matters, that can determine which species persist, are what types of plants are we planting? So thank you to all of you who are very active in native plant gardening, because you make a very big difference. Because there are native, our insects are right there with plants as being kind of the foundation of the food chain. And our native insects can sometimes only survive with specific native plants. And then so by making those native plants available, we support more of our native species. And the effects of that ripple up the food chain. Supplemental feeding. Are people feeding wildlife, and what are they feeding them? And is it a good thing or a bad thing? So in general, the only type of feeding that you can do is you can have a bird feeder in your backyard. Other than that, don't feed wildlife. You're going to cause problems. Another thing is residual pesticides. So things like insecticides or rodenticides. The way rodenticides work is it's really kind of not pleasant. A snap trap is much more humane and faster, but rodenticides, they cause the rodent to bleed out internally, and that can take a little while. But in the process, the rodent may find its way like outside of your house, or at least I hope so. So it's not like stuck in your wall and getting really stinky. But when that happens, a native predator can come along and it's a great free snack, right? Now, obviously it's going to take a lot more rat poison to kill a coyote or a barred owl or any large predator than it does a rat. But if that owl eats enough of these poisoned rats, it can accumulate in the system of the owl to the point that it actually kills the owl. So we need to be mindful of the chemicals that we're putting out into the environment. And sometimes things like insecticides and herbicides are necessary, but we just need to be mindful of how we're using them. So back to that urban to wildlife, urban to rural gradient. This picture may not be as intuitive. As we move from the rural area to the more urban area, the biomass, or basically the number of individuals, tends to increase. And that kind of seems a little counterintuitive. So let's talk about why that is. We have different types of critters, and some critters like to be in the city and around people, and some don't. And so the paper that originally kind of talked about this had birds specifically in mind, but I think that these principles can apply to a lot of different types of species besides just birds. But on one end of the spectrum, we have urban exploiters, and these are basically species that actually kind of like to be around people. They're basically commensals with humans at this point, meaning that they don't necessarily hurt us, but they're around and they benefit from us. And so these are things like grackles or pigeons, birds that really kind of like to hang out around people that you can find in large numbers in the city. And because these guys like being in the cities so much, sometimes that means that we have more biomass in urban areas than we do rural areas. Also, wildlife in cities tends to be more condensed together because there's less available space. And then, so kind of in between here, we have the urban adapters. So these are the species that, you know, you're not going to find them in downtown Dallas, but they're sure all over Arlington, right? And so these are things like scissortail flycatchers or eastern phoebes. Like they do pretty good in backyards and things like that, whereas they just need a little bit of green space. And then on the other, and you know, finally, you've got the urban avoiders. And so these are the species that really don't do well with disturbance and want nothing to do with people. So something like a quail. So what makes the exploiters good at being exploiters? Well, they're not scared of people, for one, right? Like these are the guys that are going to be totally cool with munching on French fries out of your shopping cart at Target. Like they're good with it. They have no qualms about using the free resources that we provide to them. They are not skittish around people. They also tend to not really be very territorial, and they live in large groups. They typically are not going to migrate because they're getting all of the stuff that they need in the city year round. And they tend to be pretty flexible in their behavior. They're very adaptable. So they're good with kind of rolling with the punches and, oh, this field that I used to go eat in is now gone. That's cool. I'll find somewhere else, right? They're not super stressed out. They're generalists, and they're good at adapting. Being good at adapting usually means that they're going to have a relatively larger brain than other birds might. So they tend to be fairly smart, and they also tend to be cavity nesters. So in spite of all of these things, though, what y'all should know, and I'm sure you do know as master naturalists, is that urban areas have a lot of biodiversity, even though they've kind of got all of these things that on their surface seem like it's all stacked against them. So this is Tandy Hills in Fort Worth, and this is another really good example of kind of like a habitat island, because there's not a lot of connectivity, right? It's surrounded by houses and I-30. So if you're a mouse and you want to get across the highway, good luck. It's going to be a little bit difficult. But Tandy Hills has over 1,400 species that have been documented on iNaturalist. And that is a tremendous amount of biodiversity for a park that's about 200 acres in size. That's a lot. And kind of looking on a larger scale, we have the City Nature Challenge, which I know a lot of y'all are familiar with. If you're not, iNaturalist is a citizen science website where people basically record observations of living things that they see. And once a year, they have a global challenge to see which city can record the most nature. And these are the 2020 results. Eventually, I'll update it with 2021 results. But in 2020, we had over 101,000 observations of living things in 7 metropolitan areas in Texas that documented over 6,400 species. And there were also 1,700 observations, not 1,700 species, but 1,700 observations of species of greatest conservation need. And the species of greatest conservation need is a species whose population is in decline and has been identified by Texas Parks and Wildlife as needing conservation action in order to prevent it from declining further. And so in these cities, which really should not be the place that we're finding struggling species, right? There were over 1,700 of them documented in like a 4-day period in 2020, and that's really significant. And the other thing that's really significant about this is we had 4,700 people out observing and 1,800 identifiers. So that is a lot of people in our cities who care enough about nature to go out and document it to contribute to this global citizen science project. And so that shows that not only do we have a lot of nature in our cities, but we have an active constituency of people who care about that nature. So why do we have so much nature in our city? Why do we have so many different species in our cities? When development happens, it removes what is there, and the niche that existed before has been altered. And sometimes that kind of creates a vacuum that new species can find and come in and occupy and take advantage of those shifting conditions. And synurbanization is basically the fancy term for how wildlife manages to persist even in the face of development and urbanization. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. So urban wildlife faces different stressors than wildlife in more rural areas because people are here and the landscape is different. So sometimes they respond to people by altering their activity patterns. So we may, like coyotes are a great example of this, because in rural areas, coyotes are predominantly active during the daytime. In urban areas, they are predominantly active at night or in the evening and early morning hours. So they shift their activity patterns because they don't want to be around us. And so that can also change how their prey behaves. Like if, something like a skunk was maybe more active, is more nocturnal by nature, and the coyote, maybe the skunk's not the best example, but you get the idea. If their prey is more active at nighttime, and then suddenly the coyotes start becoming more active at nighttime, then the prey may have to start shifting their thing, which can cause stress. Noise pollution can also be a significant stressor for species that have used vocalizations either to reproduce or just to communicate with each other. So think about birds. It's difficult for them to hear each other sometimes. And there's one study done that looked at Cooper's hawks that documented that the Cooper's hawks were vocalizing more often in more urban areas. So they're trying to be heard by the other hawks. Some studies also show that in urban areas, birds start calling earlier in the morning and keep calling later in the evening. And some of that may have to do with that heat island effect. It's warmer, and also artificial lighting can influence their activities. Warmer temperatures can lead to that heat island again, can lead to a prolonged growing season. We also, obviously in urban areas, there's more cars, you're gonna have more road mortality. Because wildlife is often more densely populated in urban areas, we have increased disease spread. If the last year has taught us anything, we know that the more individuals you have in the smaller of a space, the more contact you have, the more opportunities for disease spread there are. So the more, that's it. The more contact you have, the more disease spread. And sometimes those high densities of wildlife, something like a white-tailed deer, for example, can have a significant impact on the plant community. So herbivores, they're hungry, they eat down all the plants, those plants are gone. And that can in fact influence everything else in that ecosystem. So to do a little bit of research on some of the critters, my predecessor in this position several years ago worked with a graduate student at Utah State University, and they were doing to do a study on the bobcats in sort of like the mid-cities region of Tarrant County. And they put GPS tracking collars on 10 bobcats, and they also did a trail camera study, and they were able to capture photos of 49 different individuals, and they used this information to look at their home range size, the population density, and how they're using the habitat. And basically what they found is that they had higher population densities than their rural bobcats would have. They also tended to have smaller home ranges, and they generally avoided areas with high human activity. And again, creeks were important travel corridors. So if you see that picture, all of those dots, that's a location for one single bobcat. And so it kind of gives you an idea of where in the landscape they were going. Now we believe that the reason, and this is not specific to bobcats and DFW, this is kind of a general trend that we have with urban carnivores, where they tend to have higher densities and smaller home ranges in urban areas. And it's thought that the reason for that is because there's limited habitat availability, but a high abundance of prey. So they don't have very much room to spread out, but there's also a lot of food to support these animals. Urban raptors are another kind of interesting case. So raptors that eat smaller prey, so things like screech owls or Mississippi kites, do well because we have a lot of small birds, we've got a lot of insects, we've got a lot of rodents. Hawks that eat commensal rodents, so like the invasive rodents like the roof rat and the house mouse that basically live alongside people at this point, or they're dependent on us at this point. They're not native to our area. But things like the red-tailed hawk that eat a lot of those guys also tend to do well in urban areas. Hawks that have large home range requirements typically don't do too well, which is probably pretty intuitive. Vultures are kind of interesting because there's been studies that have looked at them globally, and they tend to increase their numbers during the early stages of development. Probably because if you have a lot of development going on, there's probably going to be a fewer more displaced critters that don't make it, and that works out pretty well for the vultures. And so they increase during the earlier stages of development, but then they kind of level off. And then urban raptors, it's also species that do well in urban environments also tend to be willing to use new types of nesting structures. And so this picture here is of the peregrine falcon. This is one of those species that's a great conservation success story. That this is a species that recovered from the brink. And peregrine falcons actually do pretty good in cities nowadays. Their population is much more robust than it used to be. And peregrine falcons can persist in New York City, and we've got them around DFW too. So this is a good example of a species that does very well in urban areas. And it's a species that was once, on the brink of extinction. So some other common things that we see with wildlife in our cities. They tend to have reduced migratory behavior. They tend to have a little bit of a prolonged breeding season, which could be good or bad depending on the species. They tend to have greater longevity, but they have worse overall health, which is kind of an interesting thing. And part of the reason for that is because there's fewer native predators. And so something like an albino or melanistic or piebald individual, like this little squirrel. This isn't a squirrel that like got dipped in paint. His fur grows that way. It's called piebald, where it's like part white and like part normal color. Typically those guys, they're not as well camouflaged. That makes them more vulnerable to predators. So they get picked off more easily by predators. And in urban areas, it's more likely to see those kind of genetic anomalies survive to adulthood or even reproduce. There was a study done on Cooper's hawks that found that they were feeding their babies more often, but they had a worse survival rate compared to rural Cooper's hawks. And they found that the reason was due to the high prevalence of avian diseases on the prey that they were feeding them, because there's that increased disease spread. And so, it's more common to see. So that's one way that can negatively impact survival. Let's see, we also tend to see changes in their nesting habits, altered feeding behavior. So they may eat different foods or eat at different times of day. And we also have greater intraspecific aggression. So I want to talk just a little bit about evolution, because we tend to think about evolution as this thing that happened a really long time ago, and now it's done, and we've got all of our cool species, right? But if we pay enough attention, we can see evolution happening on a small scale around us. And it's sometimes more evident in urban areas because of all of those barriers to dispersal mean less gene flow. And that means we have reduced genetic diversity. And so we have less influx of new genes into the system. So we can see changes in urban populations sometimes happening in as few as 2 generations due to the pressures of natural selection. So I've got just a few examples here. One study looked at crested anoles in Puerto Rico, and they found that they have longer limbs and more toe lamellae, which are the little all of the lines and ridges and structures that they have on their toe pads that create that good friction. And they think that is because the advantage to having longer limbs and more friction on your toes is that it makes it easier to climb up concrete and built surfaces that are more difficult to climb than their natural trees and other things. There was another study done where they took moths from an urban area and some from a rural area, and they turned on artificial lights, and they found that the moths, the same species of moth that was from an urban area, was less likely to come to those artificial lights than the ones from the rural areas. House finches in Tucson have longer and wider beaks, and they think that is because of the predominance of sunflowers, seeds, and bird feeders, which take that longer and wider beak to open. And holly hawksbeard is a plant that is very similar to dandelions that's found in the UK. And in urban areas, they found that they have heavier seeds than the same plant in a rural area. And so think about a dandelion. They have those great wind dispersed seeds, right? And if the seed is heavier, it's going to fall closer to the parent plant than if it's lighter. And so the advantage there is those seeds that fall closer to their parent plant may be more likely to fall in dirt instead of concrete. So it's an interesting adaptation that that plant has, or an interesting change that that plant has experienced. So here in DFW, I want to talk a little bit about a project that I've started to kind of help increase our understanding of urban wildlife and how they do things here in DFW. So this is a project that was originally the idea of the Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago. And they have the urban wildlife, they have an urban wildlife institute there, and they do a lot of great urban wildlife research. And they started this urban wildlife information network. And this is cities, the idea is eventually to become global. And right now they have 35 cities participating in this project across the US and Canada. And so this right now is predominantly using camera traps to monitor wildlife along the urban to rural gradient. So each city that participates, they designate a transect or several transects within their city, and that kind of follow that developed to less developed pathway, and monitor wildlife on there. And so they set cameras out 4 times a year. And the cameras are set for 1 month at a time, so 4 weeks. And so right now they're doing camera traps. They've also recently, they're doing a pilot project right now using an audio recording device called Audio Moth that they're going to use to look at monitoring birds and maybe bats as well. With that Audio Moth device. So that's pretty cool because camera traps are not ideal for birds. You get birds on them for sure, pictures of birds on the camera traps for sure, but they're really set for mammals. So anyway, I've been working with folks at the Fort Worth Nature Center as well as UNT and Texas A&M Commerce for a while. To start this project, and we just had our first sampling season in April. And as you can see, the blue line there is the transect. So starting, excuse me, following the Texas 199 corridor, starting just south of downtown Fort Worth and going all the way out towards Springtown. Take a quick drink here. And so I'm really excited about this because I think it's important to learn more about the city, about the wildlife that we have in our city. So I've got a few pictures here from that first sampling season. So of course we had tons of the usual stuff, right? Like tons of, well, not tons of coyotes, but several coyotes, lots and lots and lots of gray foxes, which was cool. These guys are pretty charismatic. We also just got some kind of fun photos of common species like these white-tailed deer hopping the fence. And you know, these species are common. Like I'm not going to surprise anyone by telling you that there are white-tailed deer in Azle, right? But it's important to know that they're common. And collecting baseline data on these species can end up being really important. So I gave the same presentation last week to a different organization, the Friends of Southwest Nature Preserve, and someone on there, John Darling, I'll call him out by name, mentioned that you know, in his line of work, he documented 13 lined ground squirrels and flying squirrels in Arlington 50 years ago. Wouldn't it be great if we had information about what their populations levels were like, you know? And so having baseline data on the stuff that is common now might be really important in 50 years because it may not be common. Let's see, here's just another fun photo. Lots of raccoon pictures. This raccoon managed to catch an unfortunate turtle, which raccoons, you know, they've got those long skinny hands, so they're really good at scooping out turtles. But in addition to these, you know, thousands of photos of the really common stuff, we got some photos of not common stuff. So I'll let y'all look at this photo for a little bit, and you can tell me, and I'm sure some of you know what this is. I stared at this photo for a very long time before I worked up the courage to be like, no, it can't possibly be anything else. This has got to be an eastern spotted skunk because there's nothing else that would have that pattern. And I sheepishly sent it to Daniel Price at the Fort Worth Nature Center. I was like, hey, what do you think this is? Because you just don't want to be wrong with something like that, because it sounds crazy. And part of the reason why I thought that this was so crazy, so let me back up here a second. If you, so the eastern spotted skunk is a species that is in decline across its entire range. And this is a species that is identified as a species of greatest conservation need by Texas Parks and Wildlife. So it's not quite at that threatened or endangered threshold yet, but we want to do more to help this species so it doesn't end up being listed as threatened or endangered. Because our goal is to keep species off that list, because once they make it onto that list, that's a whole lot of regulation, that's a whole lot of money, that's a whole lot of manpower that has to be in place to help recover those species. And so part of the reason why, like, my jaw was so on the floor about this is because we know that they're here in DFW. We know that they're here in Fort Worth. They've been documented a couple of times at the Fort Worth Nature Center. So this was kind of one of those species that I was like, it would be really cool if with this project, I got a picture of it one day, right? This picture is from downtown Fort Worth, which is about the last place that I would have ever expected to find an eastern spotted skunk, okay? And I have cameras at the Fort Worth Nature Center, and I have cameras at rural properties in Springtown that are several hundred acres in size. We did not get a picture of a spotted skunk at those properties. So this is very counterintuitive to what I would have expected. And I reached out to Clint Perkins, who researches spotted skunks, about this, and he only has one other documentation that he's aware of a spotted skunk this close into the city, and it was in Florida. So this is a pretty unusual observation. Now, what was it doing there? Well, apparently this was the peak of spotted skunk mating season, and males have been known to travel about 10 miles in a week during that time, looking for some love. And so it's likely that this guy was just passing through, but isn't it cool that we have evidence that it was able to use a little tiny patch of green space in downtown Fort Worth as part of its journey, right? So I didn't think that I would ever get anything as cool as that. And so so the way that it works, you set your cameras, you come back in 2 weeks and you check them, and then you come back in another 2 weeks and remove them. So this was at the 2-week check. So I'm like, wow, I hit the lottery right out of the gate. 2 weeks later, I got this photo at that same camera in downtown Fort Worth. And so this is a ringtail, which ringtails, unlike the spotted skunk, they're not in decline. Their numbers are much higher in other parts of Texas, like in the hill country, but they generally, they're fairly elusive. They're good at avoiding people. And this, so this ringtail, again, I know that we have some at Lake Mineral Wells State Park, pretty far to the east. The only other observation of a ringtail on iNaturalist that I could find in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, there's one from like a parking garage in Dallas, which doesn't really make sense, but there's only one other observation. So, this species is not one that's in decline throughout its range, but it's really uncommon in our area. So again, it's really cool that we have this documented here in downtown Fort Worth. And so I'm excited for this project because for a lot of reasons, but like we've only done one sampling season, and already the way that I'm going to think about what may or may not be in some of the more developed parts of our transect has changed. And these types of studies can help influence how we think about urban green spaces, and also can help us advocate for those urban green spaces, because this can show you that like a tiny little patch could actually be a really significant habitat, because look at all of the species that can be found there. So if you, I will put in a shameless plug here, if you would like to help me review some of these thousands of photos, I have my email at the end of this presentation, because I always need, I will always need some help with that. And I know that there are several people tuning in right now who have helped me a lot with this already by helping me in the field with cameras, or spending some time in front of your computer identifying some of these images for me. So thank you so much for your help with that. And if anyone else is interested in helping to review photos, we've still got a few thousand to go for the April sampling season, and we are putting out cameras next week for the July sampling season. So let me know if you're interested. And this is a CTMN improved project, so you'll get volunteer hours for it too. So what can we do in addition to studying the wildlife in urban areas? What else can we do to help improve our urban areas for wildlife? Well, one is to think about where wildlife and people are most likely to interact, and think about how we can make sure that those interactions are positive and not negative. So let's be proactive in thinking about how we can reduce human wildlife conflict wherever possible. So this is pretty simple stuff, usually like keeping your trash secured and not feeding wildlife. But thinking about how we can reduce human wildlife conflict is really important. Also, we can work to create safer spaces for wildlife. So things like lights out initiatives, that's starting to catch a little bit of steam. That was in the news quite a bit during this spring migration, where we had several, like Dallas and Fort Worth, at least I know, were turning off their lights at night so as not to reduce mortality among birds migrating through. But reducing the amount of light pollution we have is super important for birds and for other species as well. Looking at our infrastructure design. So how are we designing our cities? Is it friendly to wildlife, or is it not friendly to wildlife? Because there are ways that we can design structures and design green spaces that are beneficial to both people and wildlife. And so this is an example right here. This is the first land bridge in the state of Texas. And this is in San Antonio. So land bridges were something, one of those things that you heard about is like, oh, in Europe, they're doing this for a long time, or there was one in Canada. But now we have them in Texas. So this is Phil Hardberger Park in San Antonio. And this is a land bridge going over this road that is connecting two sides of this park. And they've also got like a hike and bike trail in there. I don't know if it's paved or not, so I'm not sure on that. But and so this is something that both people and wildlife can use for recreation. Wildlife can use it for critical transportation. Those two habitat patches are connected now. People can enjoy it too. And there's another one that is planned for Memorial Park, I believe, in Houston. So this is something that's really cool, that's catching on and can really help with preventing road mortality and keeping wildlife off the roads, because that's also bad for us. Like, you can get seriously injured if you hit a white-tailed deer with your car, right? So creating safe crossings for wildlife is important. We also need to be mindful of how we're using pesticides and herbicides. They're tools we have to have in our toolbox and use sometimes, but let's be careful with how we're using them and be mindful of it. And then finally, provide habitat. So doing things like habitat restoration, providing legal protection for open space, and actively working to conserve open space. If y'all haven't heard already, the city of Fort Worth has recently started an open space conservation program, which is really exciting. They're going to be buying land to set aside and preserve as open space. And they said that, so they put this out for a vote to the city before they started the program. And I believe it was 85% of the respondents were in favor of creating this open space conservation program. So that's huge. So let's never forget that the majority of the public wants to have these green spaces and wants to have wildlife out there. And finally, I've talked about quite a bit tonight, but native plant landscaping is another great way to, even in like, so that way even our more developed spaces, our less natural spaces, have that element of the natural environment and are appealing to wildlife. And with that, I will be happy to answer any questions y'all have.
We did have one question about, well, whether you could share your slides. And also, this recording will be posted to our website if that is okay with you.
That's fine. And I can share. I'll email, I guess, Mary Beth, I can email you my slides, and
Okay.
y'all can share it with whoever wants it.
Thank you. I'll put it on our website. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't see any other questions.
I think you gave us so much information. We don't have as many questions because you answered so many.
Hey, if y'all are gonna let me off the hook easy, I'll accept that. But if anyone has questions, I'm also happy to answer your questions.
That was really interesting.
Great presentation.
Thank you, everyone. Okay.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you guys.
All right, here is a question. I did find one. Do you think you caught some of those rarer species in the city because there isn't as much room to roam?
Possible. But I also, yeah, maybe it's possible that there's just so little space for them to walk and, to walk, that my odds of putting my camera somewhere where they will walk in front of is greater. Right. Maybe it's possible.
Right.
It'll be interesting to see as this project goes on, what sort of what our detection rate is of the various species that are out there.
Well, here's a question from John McFarlane. There's a pair of red-tailed hawks in my neighborhood near downtown Fort Worth. I've only seen one pair. Do they require a large home range so there's only one pair?
Oh, I don't know what the home range of red-tailed hawks is offhand. But I think they do maintain a little bit of a territory, so they probably don't want another pair right next to them. They're not colonial nesters the way like something like a great blue heron would be.
And then Paul Roach said, on the bobcat map, why was there nothing in the wooded area on the right?
I don't know. I don't know. Somewhere I have the map of like all of their overlapping home ranges of all of the bobcats. So that may have been another bobcat's territory, or maybe that bobcat just didn't want to go there while it was being tracked. I don't know.
Is there training to do the photo ID work on your cameras?
Yep. Yeah. If y'all want to do the photo, if y'all are interested in doing the photo ID, all it takes is you do have to have a Gmail email address, because the database is it's hosted in Google. So you have to have a Google account, and then you just use your Google account credentials to log in. It's pretty, I don't think it's that difficult to do. It's kind of similar to iNaturalist. If you spent some time in iNaturalist, you just kind of go in and you type in what you think it is and pull from a drop down, and 2 people have to review each photo. And if those 2 people disagree, then it has to go to a 3rd person for validation. So if you get it wrong, it's not the end of the world. But you have a specific list of species that you can choose from. So it does help to be kind of familiar with the species that we have in this area, feel comfortable identifying our mid-sized mammals at least. And then, so yeah, and I can walk you through it if you're, if you need help, I can train you for sure.
Well, and if the person doesn't know, just can't decide, then we leave that one for you and for the other experts.
Yeah.
To do. I found a couple questions, Mary Beth. Question about the inner city camera. Was that near the river? You said it was south of downtown Fort Worth. So would that have been near a river area?
So I don't want to say exactly where that camera is, other than saying it's in downtown Fort Worth. And if you want to guess at maybe where that was, then have at it. But I don't want to say exactly where it was.
Sure. And it looked like from those photos that there was some trash in that area. Were they possibly attracted to the trash?
So in all of the photos that I had, from that camera, which lots of critters walked in front of that camera. There's a gray fox that was very active in that area, as well as like raccoons and possums and a lot of the typical things that you would expect to see. I never saw any of them interacting with the trash.
Okay.
So yeah. And that trash there was not like, it wasn't food trash. It was like waste trash. So
got one here. Christy says she's pretty sure she saw an alligator in downtown Dallas in a canal. Is that possible? Christy, Rob Denkhouse talked to us earlier this year, and yes, that's very possible.
Yeah, it is. And we kind of joke about the alligators sometimes because, and this happened very recently, where there are alligators in DFW. They're not in huge numbers, but they're here. They've always been here. Every so often, someone sees one, and then like news gets a hold of it, and then you end up with these news stories that are like, local person sees alligator. It's like, like, alert the presses. And so everyone kind of freaks out because they get reminded that alligators are here, and then it dies down. So yeah, it's possible. Non-confirmed, but I've had someone tell me that they saw one at Bachman Lake one time. I don't know, it was just a random person on the phone who called me to tell me. So I don't know how reliable that is, but there's that. So yeah, it's possible.
How long will your observation project last?
So there is no end date to this project in mind. So for the foreseeable future, till it's not useful or we can't keep it going any longer.
And Donna said, do you recommend putting game cameras on Army Corps land, such as Lake Grapevine? I would think you need permission from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
Yeah, so that's step one is before you put a camera out anywhere, make sure you have permission. And I guess, you can if you want to. If you want to like do that and upload it to, upload your observations to iNaturalist just to monitor what's going on around Lake Grapevine. As long as you have permission, I don't see any reason why you can't.
Ellen says, how do we help our neighbors not be afraid of coyotes?
Yeah, so I have some information about coyotes that I would be happy to share. I've got some handouts and a video to talk about coyotes. And I think it's just, you know, you got to talk with people. And coyotes are a tricky one. Everyone will tell you that they saw an 80-pound coyote. They don't care that a 40-pound coyote is a really, really big coyote by coyote standards in our area. And so there's a lot of fear with coyotes. The thing about, and part of the reason for that is coyotes tend to be like fluffy and tall and lanky. So they look bigger than they are. But anyway, you know, and I think what kind of helps, at least when I talk to people who are concerned about coyotes, is, you know, what I tell people is like, you know, they're here. They are throughout the DFW Metroplex. It is not unusual that you saw one in your neighborhood. It's, you know, most people have them in their neighborhoods and they don't realize it until that one day that they see one and they're surprised. And it's also comforting for people to know that, you know, coyote attacks on people are incredibly rare, and coyotes have been very well studied in urban areas, and we know that they have really predictable patterns of behavior. And we also know that human behavior influences coyote behavior. So if a coyote starts doing something you don't like, you have the ability to change that behavior that you don't want to see. So you can, and that's usually kind of like by removing food sources, whether they're intentional food sources, happens more often than you'd think, or unintentional food sources. So things like leaving out your trash or pet food that the coyote can also kind of come and capitalize on. And then hazing. So if you see a coyote that is in a spot where you don't want that coyote to be, or you feel like that coyote is a little too cool with the fact that you're around, so that coyote is like looking at you and seeing what you're doing instead of like running away, then you make loud noises and you throw things and you scare that coyote until it leaves. And coyotes are usually really responsive to those two things of removing resources and making it clear that humans are scary and they don't want to be around us.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We really appreciate it. And I'm glad to hear the good news too. I think everybody's glad to hear the good news stories. I'll post Rachel's email one more time in the chat. There it is. And I think there's already a couple folks that are planning to send you an email right away. So thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you guys.
Hey. We've got a few more announcements to go. Here's one that I think project leaders and people who are participating will be glad to hear about. I got this directly from our sponsor, Jacqueline Jones Doyle, our AgriLife sponsor. I asked her if we still need to continue to fill out the program preparedness forms. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you didn't have to fill one out earlier this spring. We do not have to continue to fill out those PPP forms. We do not have to continue filling out screening forms unless you have an overnight event. I don't know of any of our projects that are overnight. AgriLife, as well as Parks and Wildlife, is encouraging social distancing. They're encouraging masks, but those are not required. We are supposed to continue to be completing sign-in sheets. So if you're a project leader, please do keep a list of who is at each workday. But as Jacqueline says, we're going to keep, this is in line what we've already been doing all along. And so, of course, we're going to keep doing our sign-in sheets. I presume that's, you know, in the unfortunate case that something bad happens, that's why we'll need those sign-in sheets. If Carol is still here, Carol, could you begin to get ready to load those photos again for folks who didn't see them before the meeting?
Yes. I'll be
If
happy
it's
to.
all right with you, I'll keep talking and give a few more announcements. The state annual meeting is being planned. I was at a small group meeting today as a Zoom meeting with Michelle and Mary Pearl. And they said they got as many project proposals this year as they ever had. And they gave us accidentally gave us a quick glimpse at the schedule, but they didn't leave it on there long enough for me to copy anything. But I saw some really cool looking presentations. I saw a couple of different presentations on turtles, and the one that I'm gonna, you can't sign up for this until I do. It's birding by ear. I saw that presentation. I thought, cool. Remember, you can attend the state annual meeting virtually, or you can attend in person. Some of us who've done this a few times enjoy attending in person. It will be at the DFW Airport Marriott in Irving. You may not get, if you sign up on the website on August 1st, the hotel may be full. I think some of you folks that have done this for many years stay up until midnight so that you can get the hotel reservations. There are several other motels in the area, and I took a quick screen cap. Now let's see if I can catch this screen cap here. Share screen. Okay, now I will make it all full screen. If you think you may want to stay in the area, you may not want to commute. As you can see here, here's the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport Marriott. There's plenty of other hotels on Highway 114, Best Western, La Quinta, Town Place, Home Suites, Holiday Inn. So there are hotels to stay in nearby, even if you don't quite catch the registration at the Airport Marriott. And I'll try and get that that map into the next newsletter. If you want to attend the in-person meeting and you would like a roommate, and you don't have a roommate already, go ahead and contact me, and I will keep a list, or I'll find someone to help me keep a list so that we can get you roommates. You can email me at president@ctmn.org or my personal email. Am I getting it in the chat correctly? Yes, there it is. It's correct. Carol, are you ready to show us those winners?
Yes. Okay, if y'all are ready to watch, here we go. So this was our second annual photo contest. We had 47 entries this year, and you can see the breakdown there. And okay, well,
Right, remember right at the top, go to slideshow. Yeah,
okay, so let's go. Here we go.
you hit resume, you want to start it from the beginning.
There.
No, there it goes. It's fine. I'm going to keep talking if you don't mind, and I apologize to those of you who do mind. Again, in regards to the oh, there's one for Chris Castoro. Yay, Chris.
Yeah.
There's Khaki. That's the name that needs to be spelled differently, Carol. Khaki Cunningham.
I will change that.
Thank you. Lori. I said I was going to talk, and all I'm doing is reading the names.
We have such good photographers in our chapter.
Avon. That should be a greeting card. That's just beautiful.
It is. It's very beautiful. And it's our state bird besides that.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to know who all those people are. I recognize some faces, but some I do not. And I definitely recognize all those. Kate Morgan, Sharon Hamilton, and Sandy Thornburg. First place on Plant Life, Dick Shack. Second place is Lori Chernovsky.
Look at those shadows.
Yeah, we have 3, Avon again with Plant Life, an honorable mention. We had 3 judges. One was a professional photographer and the other 2 were amateur natural or native, photographers. Love this shot.
Beautiful.
Our very own Mary Beth Plant, first place. Vicki Brooks. Love to be there now. David Bestrel. Honorable mention. And our very Zachary Chapman in first place in wildlife. Bet y'all can't guess when that was taken. And this is very cool. Second place is Lori Chernovsky with a garden spider and her mate. Another David Vestal with honorable mention in wildlife. Wildlife, David Hunter, congratulations. That's a beautiful shot. And another Dick Shack, honorable mention. Possum balancing on a tightrope of life. Little baby. So
Thank you.
that's it. Thank
you,
everybody
Carol.
who participated.
There is almost always an art, a photography and art contest for the state meeting. And so we're going to encourage you folks to enter those photographs into the state meeting contest.
Yes, and they don't necessarily have to be this year. If you want to enter a photo in the contest, it could be something from last year or last 10 years. It just needs to be in Texas. That's probably the biggest things. There's other qualifications to enter the state photo contest and media, but you can read those on the website. Thank you, everybody.
Is there anyone else who would like to make any announcements? I have a couple more, not necessarily the most fun announcement right here, but in order to help the state folks that are organizing the state annual meeting, there are field trips involved. And the group that's organizing those field trips has chosen 5 locations. We have chosen the Fort Worth Nature Center. We've chosen Britt. We've chosen the Lake Louisville Environmental Learning Area, Coppell Nature Park, and Bob Jones Nature Center. Those last 3 are very near where the hotel is. And the request is that we, members of local chapters, avoid signing up for those field trips during the state meeting in order to allow the small number of people who can be on the field trips be people who are not in our own home locations. And so I know it's over a month away, but begin to think about, consider carefully before you click that you want to attend one of these state meeting field trips. And my request to you guys is if we could have someone organize a chapter event some Saturday, say in November, or who knows what the weather is, but possibly, you know, before we had Snowmageddon, we had this wonderful, fairly nice January and part of February. We can organize some Saturday event where as a chapter we meet at one of those locations and have our own field trip there. So I'll say those again. Besides Fort Worth Nature Center and Britt, Lake Louisville Environmental Learning Area, which they call LELA, the Coppell Nature Park, and the Bob Jones Nature Center, which is in South Lake. So please think about that. And if you think it's a good idea, let me know. If you think you might be willing to organize a Saturday morning field trip for that, let me know. I think that our Saturday afternoon field trip, I think that would be a lot of fun if even just 10 or 12 of us got together to go on one of those. I am also looking for recommendations for a person who could lead one of these field trips at the Nature Center. The request is that we do a geology field trip. And I avoided geology classes, and I'm late to appreciating geology. I'll pretend that has to do with teaching teenagers, and if it doesn't move, they're not interested in it. So if you you can put somebody's name here in the chat who you think would be a great leader of a hike or a field trip at the Nature Center with emphasis on geology. I will be sending out to all of the members a survey probably tomorrow. You'll get an email with a link for you to complete a survey on when are we ready to go back to in-person meetings. A few of us have begun to discuss that, but that's really where we are, is beginning to discuss that. And my last thing is, don't forget, if you would like to order your license plates, you can go to myplates.com. I had to scroll a long way down to find the Master Naturalist license plate, but I finally found it. And that is, if you don't know what I'm talking about, we finally have one of those cool license plates like the Big Bend license plate or the horned lizard license plate or the blue bonnets. We finally have one for Texas Master Naturalists, and that's available at myplates.com. And some of you are already there because I tried to get CTMN 01 and it's taken. And then I tried to get CTMN 16 and it's taken. So I know some of you have already ordered your license plates. And that is the end of my announcements. Anyone else? All right. Well, we had a quite a busy meeting here, and I know there are about 3 folks who are staying on because this is the time when we're all sitting at our computers, and that's Mary Beth and Kayla and Ryan. Is that right, Mary Beth? Okay.
Yes.
So if you all will stay on, and the rest of you have a great evening, and get outside. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye-bye.